When you model rules, you want to make sure that there are no logical problems in your rule sheet. Logical problems may not be easy to spot by reading the rules. Corticon Studio provides powerful utilities that can check for conflicts, incompleteness, hidden dependencies, and unintended loops so that you can address them early on. Let's start by checking for conflicts. Here is a very simple rule sheet that is based on the cargo vocabulary. It has two rules. Rule 1 checks if cargo weight is less than or equal to 20,000, and if so, assigns a standard container. Rule 2 checks if cargo volume is greater than 30, and if so, assigns an oversized container. To check for conflicts, we click Rulesheet, Logical Analysis, Check for Conflicts. Corticon Studio has detected a conflict. The pink highlight indicates which rules are in conflict. To get to the source of the conflict, we need to expand the rules by double-clicking them. As you can see, each rule is made up of subrules. When you model rules, Corticon Studio uses the input values that you define for conditions to generate a table of all possible input values for each attribute used in the rules. Corticon Studio uses this table to generate the subrules. For example, for the cargo weight less than or equal to 20,000 condition in Rule 1, Corticon Studio identifies all the cargo volume conditions that can pair with it, less than or equal to 30, greater than 30, or null. Similarly, for the cargo volume condition in Rule 2, Corticon Studio identifies all cargo weight conditions. As you can see, subrule 1.2 is in conflict with subrule 2.1. This is because the conditions for each subrule are the same, but the actions are different. To resolve this conflict, we use the override setting. In our example, we want subrule 2.1 to override subrule 1.2 because we want an oversized container to be assigned if the cargo volume is greater than 30, regardless of the cargo weight. When you collapse the rules, the override setting shows that Rule 2 overrides Rule 1. Now let's check for completeness. If your rule sheet is incomplete, you may receive input data that you want your rules to process, but you have not defined a rule for those scenarios. Since Corticon Studio generates a table of all possible input values for each attribute used in the rules, it can also identify possible combinations of these values that are not defined in your rules. To check if our rule sheet is complete, we select Rulesheet, Logical Analysis, Check for Completeness. As you can see, Corticon Studio has detected several missing scenarios and collapsed them into a new rule. Let's take a look at the missing scenarios. We expand the new rule in column 3. Corticon Studio identified 4 scenarios that were not accounted for. Cargo weight greater than 20,000 and cargo volume less than or equal to 30. Cargo weight greater than 20,000 and cargo volume null. Cargo weight null and cargo volume less than or equal to 30. Cargo weight null and cargo volume null. Let's collapse these subrules. To address incompleteness, you have 2 choices. If the new rule is relevant to your business scenario, you can keep it and define an action for it. If the new rule is not relevant, you can disable it. You should disable the rule instead of deleting it, because if you delete it, Corticon Studio will add the rule again during a subsequent completeness check. In our example, we want to keep the new rule. If cargo weight is greater than 20,000 and or cargo volume is less than or equal to 30, we assign a heavyweight container. Next, let's check for dependencies. Here is a rule sheet with rules that process customer purchases at an online retailer. It has 3 rules. An action-only rule in row A in the Actions pane calculates the sum of the total price of all items. An action-only rule in row B calculates the total price for each item by multiplying the item's unit price with quantity. A rule in column 1 deducts a 10% discount if the customer purchases more than $50 worth of items. Let's look at the execution sequence diagram. we click Rulesheet, Logical Analysis, Execution Sequence Diagram. Corticon Studio automatically identifies dependencies between rules in a rule sheet. In this case, it identifies that the action-only rule in row A is dependent on the action-only rule in row B. So the diagram shows that the action-only rule in row B will fire first. In this example, this is exactly what we want to happen. If the diagram shows dependencies that you weren't expecting, you should review your rules and decide whether to leave them as is or make changes. Finally, let's check for loops. By default, looping is disabled in a rule sheet. That means each rule will process an entity instance only once. However, in some business cases, you may want to implement looping in your rules. When looping is turned on, the Corticon rule engine will loop through the rules until the conditions are no longer true. Corticon automatically detects looping in your rules. You can check for loops in your rule sheet by selecting Rulesheet, Logical Analysis, Check for Logical Loops. Corticon Studio shows you which rules are in a loop, the looping sequence, and which rules are self-triggering rules. You should review this information to make sure that the loops that Corticon Studio has identified match what you intend. If not, you may need to modify your rules. You have now seen how you can use Corticon Studio's utilities to check for conflicts, incompleteness, hidden dependencies, and unintended loops in your rule sheet.